This book that I've just written called Half-Life about Bruno Pontecorvo, I called it Half-Life because he had two half-lives. Exactly halfway through his life in 1950, this brilliant physicist disappeared through the Iron Curtain. The question of why has been unresolved for 60 years. But the work for which he's famous, his work on neutrinos, was all done in the second half of his life while he was in the Soviet Union. And had he not been in the Soviet Union, I am convinced that he would have won a Nobel Prize, as we shall see. So that is part of the reason why I called it Half-Life, because his life was in two halves, chronologically. His life was also in two halves at the personal level, because in addition to Bruno Pontecorvo, the physicist that we all know of, there was the hidden Bruno Maximovich Pontecorvo, the hidden communist who went to the Soviet Union for reasons to be divulged. And there has always been suspicion that Klaus Fuchs, who people have heard of, Teddy Hall, who probably you've never heard of because he was so successful as a spy at Los Alamos, and Bruno Pontecorvo, who was described by one Russian defector as the most important spy of them all. There's been speculation about that ever since. And I gradually got sucked into this. I started off to write a biography about him because a little book out there called Neutrino is the history of the search for solar neutrinos, and I discovered that Bruno Pontecorvo's life was in there all along. So I started researching his biography, and as a scientist, I suddenly discovered that I was getting into areas that I hadn't anticipated. The question of security and MI5 and all that sort of stuff. So if you want to know what the security services have on Bruno Pontecorvo, you can go and use Freedom of Information now. And this is what I did, and this is what the FBI reveal on him, everything you want to know. And the irony of all, it says down here, with logical correctness, all information contained herein is unclassified, because there's no information contained there. Okay, so I thought I would, in the first half of the talk about who he is, who he was, in the first half of his life in the Western world, pre-war, to give a feeling for why he was a nuclear physicist of great interest, contrary to what the security services tried to make out after he disappeared. Then I will talk about his life in the Soviet Union, what he did as a scientist, why he went there, and who he was. So to set the time frames, he was born in 1913, the same year that Bohr's nuclear atom was invented. In 1919, when this picture was taken, that was the year when the atomic nucleus, the proton, was discovered. 1932, the year when the neutron was discovered, he moved to Rome to become a research assistant and student to Enrico Fermi, where he worked with neutrons. And he was one of the team known as the Via Panisperna boys. Via Panisperna was the street in Rome where the institute was. This iconic photograph on the left, many of you have probably seen, of the team. The reason Pontecorvo is not in that photograph is because he, as the youngest member, was the one who took it. And he, with his future wife, Marianne, is shown on the right there. And they were a very glamorous couple back in those days. This is 1934 or so. And while he was there, the team discovered what's called the slow neutron method. Basically, that if neutrons can be slowed down before they impact upon some nuclear material, their ability to induce radioactivity and change it is greatly increased. And that became key to the modern development of nuclear power and played a key role also after fission in the whole business of the atomic weapon program. But I'm just showing you that Pontecorvo was there at the very start of this whole business with neutrons, and it was he, incidentally, accidentally, who discovered this phenomenon in the lab, which Fermi then explained. So this is the mid-30s. Then he moved to Paris to work with Frédéric Joliot and Irene Curie, who had just won the Nobel Prize themselves for their work on induced radioactivity. And he worked on nuclear isomers. Now, for the purpose of this talk, we don't need to go into what they are. I just want to bring out the fact that it was a very small world, nuclear physics, in those days. And nuclear isomers were being worked on only by literally a handful of people. Bruno Pontecorvo was already establishing himself as a brilliant new member of the field. And in Moscow, this man, Igor Kurchatov, was also working on nuclear isomers. Kurchatov was inspired to go into this field because of the work that Fermi and people had done. The reason that I'm just telling you this fact about Kurchatov is, for later reference, that Kurchatov clearly knows about Pontecorvo professionally. They cited each other's papers. 3 years later, it is Igor Kurchatov who has been given the task of building the Soviet atomic bomb. And the first task that he did, rather than inventing the wheel again, he gave instructions through the KGB to find out what was going on in North America, who's doing what, and in particular, by this time, as we shall see, Pontecorvo was himself working in a part of the Manhattan Project. And my thesis is, given that Kurchatov and Pontecorvo knew of each other professionally in the 1930s, it is inconceivable that Kurchatov was not aware that Pontecorvo was working in the Manhattan Project later. And I have found evidence that the blueprints of the nuclear reactor that Pontecorvo was working at in Canada made their way to the Soviet Union, and a sample of uranium did also. But let's get to that in due course. So 1940, Pontecorvo is working in Paris with Joliot-Curie. The Nazis invade, and he, as an Italian in France, is of course an enemy because the Italians are on the other side. And as a Jew, he was no friend of the Nazis either. So he and Marianne and his 2-year-old son Gilles escaped. Marianne and the son by train, Bruno with his cousin, a man called Emilio Sereni, whose name will come important later, escaped by bicycle. They managed to cycle to the south of France, down into Vichy, France, literally the day that the Nazis invaded Paris. And if any of you have seen the film Suite Française, or better, read the book, you will have a sense of the drama of that time. And indeed, the Pontecorvo flight, which is one of the things I found most interesting in researching this, is a real-life example of Suite Française, but let's not go down that route here. He manages to escape the south of France, from which he then in turn manages to get to the United States, where he becomes an oil prospector. Now, you might think this has got nothing at all to do with physics, but actually it has got everything to do with it. He was the first person to introduce nuclear physics into oil prospecting. He was an expert with neutrons. He designed a means of lowering down a borehole into rocks a source of neutrons, which would then irradiate the rocks around, and from the radiation that was picked up in the detector, deduce what the nature of the rocks is, to work out, are these oil-bearing shales or are they other rocks? So this was what he was developing over those 3 years in industry. And by a series of misadventures, his former mentor, Enrico Fermi, who at this very time was in Chicago building the first nuclear reactor, made contact with Pontecorvo and realized that Pontecorvo's work irradiating rock samples under the ground had the very sort of information that Fermi needed in building a realistic nuclear reactor. I mean, a nuclear reactor irradiating uranium with neutrons, the physics of it is straightforward, but the practicalities of a nuclear reactor, where the neutrons can also hit the concrete, the metal and everything else around, induce radioactivity where you don't want it, probably destroy the whole reactor working, those were the hands-on things that Fermi needed to know, and by chance, Pontecorvo, in his oil prospecting work, knew them. And that is how Pontecorvo then got involved in the Anglo-Canadian part of the Manhattan Project, where we were building a nuclear reactor in Canada. And this map here shows actually that Pontecorvo's real value when he started on that was the techniques he had developed for looking for oil could be used for looking for uranium. And this is a map of part of Canada that was developed using Pontecorvo's neutron irradiation technique to see where uranium deposits were or are. And of course, uranium was critical to many things in the whole program. In building nuclear reactors, you needed it. To get the plutonium for the atomic weapons, you needed it. So Pontecorvo, inadvertently, was doing all the things that were needed. He was at their work in Canada at Chalk River from 1943 to 1948. And if indeed any information was passed to the Soviet Union, it was during that time. And here is one of 2 photographs that I show of the group leaders in the project at the time. Pontecorvo is the one who seems reluctant to look at the camera. There's another photograph also where he's reluctant to look at the camera. That may or may not be significant, who knows. 1948, post-war, the Pontecorvo then moved across here to England. He took British nationality and worked at Harwell, which was the first civilian development of nuclear power in the UK, or indeed in Western Europe. And he was working at Harwell until the middle of 1950. By total coincidence, Klaus Fuchs, the well-known atomic spy, was also working at Harwell during this period, and in February 1950 was exposed as having passed information about the atomic bomb right the way through the war, and he was arrested and sent to jail. You can imagine, of course, that would create a certain amount of excitement or nervousness in the authorities in the laboratory at that time. And in August 1950, indeed, Pontecorvo went off on a summer holiday from which he never returned. And we now know that he disappeared into the Soviet Union. To complete this first part of the story, he disappeared off the face of the planet for 5 years. Even people in the Soviet Union didn't know he was there. It was so secret. His son, who I mentioned earlier, who was 2 when they escaped the Nazis in 1940, by this stage was 12. He was a student at a school in Abingdon, the town that I happen to live in. It turns out I live just 5 minutes' walk from the house the Pontecorvos were living in 1950. And it turns out there are people in their 80s alive in Abingdon today who still remember the Pontecorvos from 1950. And I also, through Abingdon School, where his son was for a year, managed to make contact with his contemporaries from that time. And their stories are also fascinating, but I don't want to get diverted into too many things. Through Gilles Pontecorvo, who is now a 75-year-old retired nuclear physicist, still living in Moscow, I made contact through Skype, a wonderful medium. And we managed to get hold of the secret logbooks that Pontecorvo Senior was working in that 5 years. And they reveal an interesting story, which I will just show you one thing before we then go on to the more regular work that he was doing. The very first questions that Pontecorvo were asked when he arrived in the Soviet Union in November 1950 are recorded here in the logbook, and for some reason the authorities there were interested in H4 particles. Now, a little quiz here. How many people here would make a guess as to what H4 particles are? Don't panic if you don't have an idea, because even professional nuclear physicists would hardly have an idea. Right, hydrogen, deuterium, tritium, H4. It doesn't exist, we know, but okay. The point at that stage was the Soviets were in desperate need of, they were also now wanting to develop a hydrogen bomb. And they needed tritium for that. But the idea, and that was Stalin who had given the instruction that they had to produce tritium for the next stage in this whole process. And somebody had the smart idea, suppose there's a super tritium, H4. If there was such a thing, it turns out that when you fuse H4 particles together, you'll release more energy than you would in fusing with tritium. And the idea was perhaps at Dubna, which we now know was an accelerator smashing alpha particles together, the possibility that if H4 particles exist, they would be produced sometimes. And so could you detect them? And if you could detect them, could you then extract them and store them? And that was the thing that they were interested in. So the first questions that Pontecorvo was being asked at that time had very direct relevance to issues of great importance. But that's, for me today, another story. Let's move on to the other half of his life, the work that he did in open science in the Soviet Union, and why he didn't get a Nobel Prize for what. So this was involved with the neutrino, and the story now in the next bit is told in the book I wrote called Neutrino, which is 1932 or so. Pauli tries to explain some anomalies in beta decay by inventing the concept of this electrically neutral particle called the neutrino, and he was convinced that nobody would ever be able to detect one to prove the idea right or wrong. So he wagered a case of champagne for anybody who could prove his idea one way or the other. And post-war, people then began to get interested in neutrinos. And the problem with neutrinos is that they are very hard to detect, that an individual neutrino, on the average, can travel through light years of lead without bumping into anything. So how are you going to detect them? And the analogy here is how many people here have won the big prize in the national lottery? Very rarely do people put their hands up. But if we had enough people, somebody would. And it's a bit like that with neutrinos, that an individual neutrino is very unlikely to win the national lottery, to get captured. But if you've got enough of them, and you wait long enough, and you've got a clever enough detector, you might pick one up. So one of the ideas was, oh, an atomic bomb explosion. That should produce vast numbers of neutrinos. But as somebody then pointed out, I think it was Fermi pointed out, this is an interesting idea, but rather hard to replicate. Putting your apparatus a meter away from an atomic bomb explosion, recording the results, and then repeating the experiment is unlikely. So the key was then to do a controlled explosion, namely a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor should be producing vast numbers of neutrinos if the idea was right. And so now suddenly things fall into place, because 1946, post-war, Bruno Pontecorvo is working in Chalk River building a nuclear reactor. He has been a student of Enrico Fermi, who is the man who has taken Paoli's idea and suggested that indeed he can make a theory of what's called beta decay, incorporating the neutrino. So these ideas are in Pontecorvo's thinking, and he starts putting them together and writes the first paper on how you might detect neutrinos at a nuclear reactor. But it is not he that discovers the neutrino at a nuclear reactor. The discovery is made in 1956 by Cowan and Reines, two Americans, and many years later Fred Reines got the Nobel Prize for this. Cowan unfortunately had died by then. But Pontecorvo was not the person who made the discovery. We have established, however, from the logbooks that claims that people have made in the Soviet Union that he had the idea independently are indeed true. In 1951, a year after he's been in the Soviet Union, Pontecorvo proposed a search for the neutrino at a nuclear reactor, the very thing that Cowan and Reines would do 5 years later. The Soviets refused him access to any nuclear reactor to do the experiment. This is a level of the sort of suspicion and things there was. So that's how he missed out on discovering the neutrino. He's disappeared for 5 years. He's finally produced to the public. By 1960, his work is known around the world, and he, at a conference, proposes that there are two varieties of neutrino, what we call the electron neutrino and the muon neutrino, and that they're different. And indeed, his tombstone up there has muon neutrino does not equal electron neutrino on it, one of the few places where people have an equation on their tombstone. So he has this idea there's two varieties of neutrino, and he proposes an experiment as to how to test that idea to prove it. And there was no facility in the Soviet Union able to do that experiment. He would have to go to CERN in Geneva to do that, and the Soviets refused him permission to leave the country. He published the idea in Russian, in a Russian journal, and 2 years elapsed before an English translation appeared over here in the West. And in the interim, 3 guys in the United States, Schwartz, Steinberg and Lederman, had basically had the same idea, performed the experiment at Brookhaven, and eventually won the Nobel Prize for proving it right. So there is an example, certainly, that a Nobel Prize was won in the West for an idea that Pontecorvo had already proposed, and that Pontecorvo was manifestly prevented realizing because, again, of Soviet suspicion. The third of the 4 great things that he did touches on what we heard earlier this morning. He is the person who predicted that a supernova should produce vast numbers of neutrinos and possibly be detectable by the neutrino blast. And indeed, that is what happened in 1987 with the supernova that we heard about earlier today, that it was detected in neutrinos. And the leader of the experiment that detected it, Koshiba, shared the Nobel Prize in 2002 for that very observation, which came directly from Pontecorvo's idea. Koshiba shared the Nobel Prize with a man called Ray Davis, and Ray Davis got it because he had spent 40 years pursuing another idea of Pontecorvo's, namely that the sun should be producing large amounts of neutrinos, and that if you have a tank with chlorine in, when a neutrino hits an atom of chlorine, it turns it into argon, which is chemically inert, but it's radioactive. And this, Davis realized, will be a great way of detecting neutrinos from the sun. The problem is that the number of neutrinos that Davis was detecting was fewer than the theory said it should be. And it wasn't until 40 years had elapsed before the whole thing was sorted out. And by that stage, the solution was found. And the solution was yet another idea of Pontecorvo's. Pontecorvo had said there are two varieties of neutrino, and he'd missed out on that Nobel Prize. But he now had a further idea that due to a vagary of quantum mechanics, as they travel across space, the neutrinos can change back and forth one into the other. So the sun is producing, as hydrogen turns into helium, it's producing electron-type neutrinos. And they travel across space, and Davis's detector, 150 million kilometers away, is designed to pick up electron neutrinos. But what happens is the electron neutrino starts out, and a bit like a sort of chimera, is changing through quantum effects into muon neutrino and then back into electron neutrino and back forth, so forth and so forth. So that by the time you get to Davis's detector over here, you've got the camera swinging around, great. There's only a 50-50 chance that it is still the magic neutrino. I'm now going back over there, okay, right. And so that's why there were too few. So Pontecorvo had it all right. Davis shared the Nobel Prize with Koshiba in 2002. By that stage, Davis was age 87. Pontecorvo, unfortunately, had died in 1993. So he never lived to see the whole thing shown to be correct, let alone sharing in that prize. So certainly, had he lived, this is a prize that he would have shared in. The two neutrino idea, it is always arguable whether he would have been successful had he been allowed to go to CERN to do the experiment, but indeed, it was Nobel quality. So this, I think, to show that, that his work was certainly of Nobel quality without any doubt. That he failed to get the Nobel Prize is certainly linked to the fact that he made this fateful decision to disappear through the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War in 1950. And so that then became my quest. Why did he do it? And I found the answer, and it was exposed in the Observer just before the book came out. And there it is, in best redacted form, revealed how blank led to the flight of nuclear scientists. And so that's the answer, and that's the end of the talk. Except it isn't, because you want to know what's in there. So I will now tell the second half of the talk, which is how, if you use a bit of research, you can dig out the truth of what is going on, or at least the truth insofar as one can ever know it. So what was different probably about me researching this compared to other people is that people historically who've been interested in this are people who are historians or historians of the Cold War, etc., etc. I was actually looking at this from a point of view as a scientist, as a nuclear scientist. And there were certain things I started noticing in the various papers that were released in the National Archives in London and elsewhere that from a scientific point of view didn't sort of totally add up. And I suspected there were still some other papers held back. And so I contacted Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, who is an academic historian who I, by chance, happen to know. And I said, look, Peter, I've got a catch-22 here. How do you use the Freedom of Information Act to get access to papers if you don't know in the first place that the papers even exist? And so he said, like a headmaster, write me a single page on A4, tell me what you're interested in, and I'll see what I can do. So I did, and I expected never to hear any more. And then I got this wonderful letter written in good old-fashioned ink on House of Lords notepaper. Dear Frank, did MI5 ever get back to you after I forwarded them your letter? Which is on the 4th of December 2012. To which the answer is yes, they did. And basically, MI5 very carefully sidestepped the direct questions I was interested in, but actually, by chance, gave me something completely unexpected. They said, however, a file which has previously been, I think you put quotes around the next bit, a file which has previously been lost has now been found and is available for inspection. So I immediately, Christmas was over, I was down to the National Archives and looked at this missing file, and everything suddenly then fell into place. All of the files that had existed, had been available up to that time, were a classic example of government and security people's cover-ups attempt to shut the stable door off the horse was bolted. Pontecorvo has disappeared. The job is to prove that it didn't really matter, he didn't know anything, he wasn't very important, he was a low-level scientist. I mean, all of the things that we've shown you already show that that's pretty well garbage, right? But it's all afterwards. There was nothing about before. And this file was the file on Pontecorvo up to the time that he disappeared. The first thing from it was there was no evidence whatsoever against him. There was a lot of gossip saying, oh, he was a communist, or his wife had made some remarks that were overheard by somebody, etc., etc. Well, that's the nature of the beast. It was another thing that I stumbled on in there, which, however, was remarkable. And we'll come to that in a moment by setting the scene. So imagine what life was like at that period. In February 1950, this is 6 months before Pontecorvo disappears himself. In February 1950, Klaus Fuchs has been exposed as a spy, arrested, sent to jail. As a result of that, and the fact that in the United States, Senator McCarthy has got these witch hunts against anybody with even slightly socialist leanings and convinced that there's communists everywhere. The results of this are, however, with the Fuchs debacle, that spy rings are exposed in the States, the Rosenbergs end up going to the electric chair, etc., etc. There's huge paranoia, and for anybody who is even mildly associated with communism, life was very difficult. And Pontecorvo was one of many intellectuals at that time. Again, once you realise in the 1930s, as fascism rose in Europe, intellectuals had a decision to make. Are you a fascist or are you anti-fascist? And many people intellectually chose to be anti-fascist, and the Communist Party was the one organisation that really focused anti-fascism. And of course, 20 years later, the world has changed and people like Oppenheimer and others get pilloried, but that's another world. In 1930s, many intellectuals chose that route. So, jump forward now to 1950, with that background in mind. The last paper in the file before Pontecorvo disappears was this one. And if I had seen this at the start of my researches, I wouldn't have realised the full import of it. But seeing it late on, something's hit me. So let me just read it to you and explain what's going on here. So this letter has been written from the British Embassy in Washington. Patterson, who wrote it, is the MI5 representative in the British Embassy at that time. And it's sent to the Director General of MI5 in London. And it says, the FBI informed me that it's been reported to them that Bruno Pontecorvo is at present employed at Harwell. They add that they address communications, blah, blah, blah. Let me just say one thing. Pontecorvo obviously was vetted before he joined the Manhattan Project, except that he wasn't. The FBI had got information back in 1942 that Pontecorvo had communist literature in his home. Somehow this information never reached the British authorities, and because they never knew about it, Pontecorvo joins the Anglo-Canadian part of the Manhattan Project. After Pontecorvo disappears, of course, everybody's trying to blame everybody else. The Brits say, not our problem, you never sent the papers to us. The FBI saying, yes, we did, you screwed up. And one of the interesting things that I found in the files in the National Archive after Pontecorvo's disappearance is J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI and the head of the MI5 in London basically agreeing a cover-up that, we will try to make sure that we handle the media very carefully here so that this issue never comes above the radar screen. But anyway, this is the issue that has come up, that the FBI they addressed communications about Pontecorvo being a communist perhaps, 3 letters in February 1943 to British intelligence. Presumably they must have been written either direct to London or to BSC because the local SI's representative cannot trace the correspondence. Many of the files were of course destroyed. Right. Pontecorvo was evidently working on the Canadian Atomic Energy Program at Toronto, Chalk River actually, for a period during the war, but he had lived in the United States. The Bureau now asks if we can send them any information which may be available to us which would indicate that Pontecorvo may be engaged in communist activities at the present time or may have been engaged in such activities during his residence in the United States. So the FBI are wanting to know, do the Brits realise that Pontecorvo had a communist background, and do they have any evidence to suggest that he's got communist associations here and now? And this is written on the 13th of July. It's the 24th of July when Pontecorvo goes off on a holiday with his family from which he never returns. So this has come from Washington just 11 days before Pontecorvo disappears. At the top you can see the date stamp. It's received in London on the 19th, just 5 days before Pontecorvo disappears. So it's quite a coincidence that the FBI is showing interest in Pontecorvo and now Pontecorvo suddenly disappears. Except how on earth can Pontecorvo know about this? The only people involved are the head of MI5 and the MI5 man in Washington. Except that that is not quite true. When you read the letter carefully, at the end of the first paragraph, the local SIS representative cannot trace it. So, this letter says that, apart from me, the writer, Patterson, the MI5 man here, the local SIS representative in the Washington Embassy also has been helping and can't find them. SIS is the Special Intelligence Services, often known as MI6. And the SIS representative in the Washington Embassy in 1950, who is being referred to in this letter, is this man. And as they say, you can now join the dots. So Philby was fully aware that the FBI are interested in this scientist for communist reasons, but he doesn't know any more than that. Except, and now it becomes rather sort of an ironic tale of black humour, Philby is very much aware of the other big secret, perhaps the biggest secret at that stage, that the Russian diplomatic codes had been cracked. It's called the Venona Project. He was one of a literal handful of people who knew that fact. He was very interested because he was already aware that in those cracked codes there were references to his old buddies, Burgess, McLean and so forth, which would later come out. He was very nervous himself as to whether there was any reference to him in any of that stuff. So he was reading absolutely everything. And he knew that there were 3 atomic spies that had also been identified by code names, Charles, Malad and Quantum. Now, he knew already that Charles had just been identified as Klaus Fuchs. And we know that Philby tipped off the Soviet Union in February or March, too late as it turned out, about the fact that Fuchs had been identified. But the identities of Malad and Quantum he didn't know. And it is a very sensible conjecture that he immediately would suppose that one of Malad or Quantum was indeed Pontecorvo. And I say that with confidence because many scholars subsequently suggested that Pontecorvo was Malad or Quantum. In fact, today we know that they weren't. Malad was the code name for this man, Teddy Hall, who was an 18-year-old prodigy from Harvard working on the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos. And Quantum was a man called Podolsky. And those of you who've heard of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, it's that Podolsky. So it wasn't Pontecorvo, but Philby didn't know that fact. So the message then will be passed on to Moscow via his buddy Burgess in London. And by the time that Moscow get the information that the FBI are interested in this man Pontecorvo's on holiday. And his holiday, we've now pieced together thanks to his son's memories of, he was 12 at the time, as I said. They drove through France, went to Italy, had an idyllic time in Italy, swinging around. And then instead of coming back by car, flew first of all to Stockholm via Munich, and then from Stockholm after an overnight on to Helsinki, and then from Helsinki to Moscow in a car. 2 things of interest here, that Marianne Pontecorvo, his wife, her parents lived in Stockholm, but they did not visit the parents on this trip at all. They stayed one night in Stockholm and moved on. When he arrived in Helsinki, what happened next has never really been established until now. His son Gilles said to me, he said, we were met by 2 cars. In fact, he says, we met by 2 cars. My mother, me, my 2 brothers in one car, Bruno in other car in the trunk. I knew something was up. And he said, when we arrived in Moscow, my first surprise was to learn it was Moscow. He thought it was just yet more extension of the holiday. But that's another story, as they say. So that's how it got to Moscow. One further thing that I managed to establish, knowing how they went, was to go back and you find in the records the airline details of them. So there's the Pontecorvo family, Bruno, his wife, the 3 sons, all en route to Stockholm via Munich. I'm just showing you, because over here, these 2 columns show the number of pieces of baggage and the total weight of baggage. So the 60 on the right there, they had a total 60 kilograms of baggage, and it was in 10 bags. So do the maths. That's 6 kilograms per bag. That's carry-on weight. This was just camping gear. So this already adds to the belief that this was a sudden decision. It wasn't something planned. They didn't plan in advance to spend the rest of their life in the Soviet Union. If they had have done, they'd have taken Marianne's fur coat with them, right? Among other things. So they just took the camping gear. It was all done in a rush. And how it was done and who did it, look at this another way, I'll put the boxes around here because now you will see that the actual ticket numbers, that 4 of the Pontecorvos ticket numbers come together, but Bruno's comes in a different book, it's quite different from theirs, but his tickets are almost aligned with these 2 above. So Bruno's ticket has been got by the same people who got the tickets for Mr. Whitker, who is a stateless gentleman, and Mr. Allegrini. Again, their luggage is no more than hand baggage, and the green lines through their name was put there by MI5. Without a doubt, these are the 2 KGB minders who were assigned to ensure that the investment that had been made in getting Mr. Pontecorvo to the Soviet Union would be realised. And the person who probably arranged it all was his cousin Emilio Sereni, who escaped from the Nazis in 1940 with him by bicycle, and by 1950 was a communist member of the Italian government who travelled backwards and forwards to the Soviet Union quite regularly. And I suspect that Bruno probably thought that, oh, it's easy to go backwards and forwards to the Soviet Union, except, of course, it wasn't. So to just bring it towards the close and put some intriguing things together, when they arrived in the Soviet Union, they were met by a man who seemed to know Bruno and who was very helpful in getting them settled in the first days there. And this man's identity has never been revealed before. Bruno would only refer to him as a man of about my age. We've now established who he is. He's the man on this postage stamp on the right. And if you can read Russian, you can see what the name says up there. If you can't, you'll have to wait a few minutes. So let me tell you then why you're going to have to wait a few minutes, because there's a slightly other little story in parallel that I need to fill everything in for you, which is this. If indeed Bruno passed information, what was it and how is it passed? Well, we've established that another person, the Russians obviously like putting people on stamps in this series. This is a woman named Lona Cohen. She was a Soviet courier in North America in the Second World War. She made periodic visits to the Canadian border, and she met somebody from Chalk River, where Pontecorvo was working, and she took a sample of uranium back to the New York embassy of the Soviet Union, and also blueprints of the Chalk River reactor, I've established, found their way somehow to the Soviet Union at that time. Whether it was Pontecorvo or not, who knows? But what is certain, if it wasn't Pontecorvo, there's a Dr. X who was working at Chalk River who has still yet to be identified. So who is Lona Cohen? Well, Lona Cohen is actually the wife of Morris Cohen, who is also on a stamp. What's interesting about them is twofold. They were spirited out of the North America back to the Soviet Union in July 1950, just about the same time that Pontecorvo disappeared. It would be quite natural for that to happen if indeed Pontecorvo, for whatever reason, was being called back to Moscow. And these were the couriers that had dealt with him while he was out there. If you read the book, you'll see there are even more Machiavellian reasons. But I was just going to ask a question of people of my sort of generation. If I was giving this talk in England, people would probably put their hands up. I'm not so sure in Ireland. How many people here recognise the names Helen and Peter Kroger? This is Ireland for you, right. In 1962, Helen and Peter Kroger were arrested. They were supposedly a New Zealand couple living in a bungalow in Ruislip, a suburb of London, and it turns out that they were masquerading as antiquarian book dealers, and for 10 years they had been running a spy ring in the naval dockyards in Portland. It was a cause célèbre in Britain at that time, and Helen and Peter Kroger are none other than Lona and Morris Cohen. I conjecture with some background evidence that what happened is that Lona Cohen was indeed the courier from Chalk River, that Pontecorvo has been spirited back to the Soviet Union, and what the Soviets are really concerned about, after having pulled all of their North American agents out following the Klaus Fuchs debacle, Lona and Morris Cohen being their star people, they want to know, are they still in the clear? They know, the KGB know, that Pontecorvo has been questioned in Britain. That was one of the reasons why he was beginning to get very nervous. Were any questions asked about the Cohens? And clearly they were satisfied that the Cohens were in the clear, and that is why within a year the Cohens have been reinvented as the Krogers and are shipped out to England to carry on their work now in England. And I also suspect that's one of the reasons why Pontecorvo's presence in the USSR was kept quiet for 5 years. But anyway, that's another story. So let me just come towards the end to give you what happened to him at the end of his life and to leave you with an interesting, tantalizing conclusion. So for 5 years in the Soviet Union, he was effectively under house arrest. For 28 years, he was not allowed to travel outside the Soviet Union, and as we saw, that certainly affected his ability to do international science and gain some of the credits which I'm sure he deserved. The tragedies are that neither he or his wife ever saw their parents again. Doubly tragic when you realise that they went through Stockholm and never stopped and saw Marianne's mother, never suspecting that they'd never see her again. They had planned to visit Bruno's parents during the last days of that holiday in Italy. They had to cancel that suddenly and never saw them again. So it was tragic all the way through. Marianne had a mental breakdown, spent significant amounts of time in sanatoria. For her, absolutely certainly, the whole enterprise was ruinous. For Bruno, I think also, he later said, he rationalised the invasion of Hungary in 1956 as a necessity, but the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 finally convinced him that he'd been a cretin, as he later described to a newspaper reporter. He developed Parkinson's disease, and here's a picture of him at Exeter at a summer school a year before his death. And he was always a showman, doing tricks. And this particular trick was an interesting one, that he was here balancing his walking stick on his foot, because when he did that, the shaking stopped. But the moment he took the stick back into his hand, the shaking would return. There is something neurological about the way Parkinson's work. And he died on the 24th of September 1993, tragically, with the great ideas that he had about solar neutrinos and neutrino oscillations as yet still unresolved. So he never knew the answer to that. So to end, I will just tell you the final things about the three people that we saw on stamps. I had one person, one of the people who said that I could use what they told me, but I must under no circumstance give their name in the book, was a person who helped in 1990. There was this brief period after Yeltsin came in when things opened up. And a TV crew from the USA were making a program about the Rosenbergs, and they went to Moscow to look at various things. And they went to a KGB hospital along with an interpreter and a KGB press officer, would you believe? That's how it was in those days. And they met Lona Cohen, who was dying of cancer. And she confirmed that indeed she had brought information from Chalk River given to her by young scientists, but she would not say at all who they were. The second thing was they then interviewed this man, who is the one we saw on the other stamp, who is the man who had met Pontecorvo on his arrival in the Soviet Union in 1950. And this man, Anatoly Yatskov, if you do a search for him on Google, you'll find that he was the KGB chief in North America during World War II, who basically was the person in the Washington embassy through whom all atomic spy information came first of all before it was filtered and sent on to the Soviet Union. It is interesting, therefore, that he was the man who was chosen to meet Bruno Pontecorvo when Bruno arrives in the Soviet Union. It sort of all adds circumstantial evidence to the question as to maybe Bruno did indeed pass information. Finally, Bruno himself. The interviewer then said, because Pontecorvo's name had been mentioned by Yatskov, they requested an interview with Pontecorvo. And Pontecorvo declined the interview, and if any people here can read Russian or translate Russian, you will see what his reply was. Can anybody here translate Russian? Good, so you can confirm that my translation hopefully is or is not correct. He said, I want to die a great physicist, not as your fucking spy. Is that roughly correct? Thank you. Is the word, sorry, I'm not doing this for a laugh. Is the word fucking the correct description? Good, thank you. Because I'll now tell you a strange story. If you go and read the New York Review of Books of Half-Life, Freeman Dyson started off by mistranslating this, saying that it said, it wasn't, he said, Frank Close rather liberally used the word fucking here, when actually it was chewed up and spat out. And he used the word jebanyi, not jebanyi, which is a critical difference. And I went and checked with my source, and the source confirmed absolutely it was Jebany, not Gemany, which at one level was a shame, because if Pontecorvo had definitely referred to being chewed up and spat out, that is as near to a confession that he'd been used and abused by the KGB. But what he actually said, it depends what his intonation was. You can interpret it one of two ways. If indeed he never passed any information and had spent 40 years of his life as a scientist being messed about by people saying, were you a spy, were you doing this, that and the other, you would say, I want to be remembered as a great scientist, not as your fucking spy. Whereas if you had been messed about by having passed information, had your scientific career ruined by being taken back to the Soviet Union and had to face what you had done, your intonation would have been quite different. But as we weren't there, we don't know which of those two it is. So again, at the very end of all this, we have left an enigma. So to conclude, one enigma, however, we do know the answer to, revealed how Philby tip-off led to the flight of the nuclear scientist. I'll leave it to you to decide why, but that is how. Thanks.
Books, which is the science thriller, private science fiction. Maybe one quick question. If there is one.
I would just, oh yes, go ahead.
Could he have been kidnapped?
Interesting that his sole surviving sibling, he was one of 8 children, and his sole surviving sibling, Anna, my wife and I luckily met about 4 years ago, and she had been with him on that holiday from which he never returned. But she came back to England just a couple of days before his disappearance. And she had always believed that he was kidnapped. In a metaphorical state, I think the answer is yes. My theory of what happened, incidentally, is this. Kurchatov certainly knew that Pontecorvo was working on the Manhattan Project in this reactor. He knew that he was a member of the Communist Party from his time in France. And if I was Kurchatov, I would have said, could you give me the details of this nuclear reactor in order to help me build a nuclear reactor to provide energy for the good of Soviet citizenry? It would have been pretty churlish to say no. And that, at one level, is a quite innocent request, which information is passed. And then, of course, once they've got you in the net, they've got you. By 1950, Pontecorvo's know-how and brain had much more information in it than anything, actually, that Klaus Fuchs and people passed over, which was of transitory worth at best. So to have Pontecorvo in the Soviet Union working with them was a great thing to have. Whether he was duped into believing that the terrible things were going to happen to him if he went back to England because the FBI are onto you, we've got the evidence, you're going to be in the electric chair if you return, stay with us where you really would be much more comfortable, all that garbage going on with McCarthyism out there, live in the Soviet Union, have a great life and so forth, who will ever know that? So in a metaphorical sense, I think, yes, one theory I had was that he went to the Soviet Union having been told that Dubna, this great new accelerator, was being built, where he could work. His son Gilles was convinced that they were going back to start the next term at school. And it is possible that Bruno thought that he and the family could move to the Soviet Union and they would continue back to Abingdon and get their clothes and things sorted out and leave, because there was nothing illegal to stop them doing that. There was nothing that said you can't travel out of Britain and move to the Soviet Union if you want to do so, and that he was prevented. But so I think, yes, in a metaphorical sense. Thanks.